convention, hello Ottawa, the first meeting of Canada's newest political party. The first meeting where we come together and take an idea that I think has lived in the hearts and minds of many Canadians for many years, that my God, there has to be something better than what we've got. And as citizens in a democracy, taking upon ourselves the responsibility and the challenge of saying that we are not going to wait for others to step up, but we are going to stand up and we're going to make this happen. So that's why we're here, and I can tell you that I am here with one purpose: to change Canada's government, to change Canada, to prepare us for a century of unparalleled difficulties with the same confidence that our ancestors used to come to this country from around the world, to carve a life out of this country when here. It starts with you. It starts with our team, and I want to spend a couple of minutes just talking about some of the folks who've helped us get here. Rick Peterson's been mentioned a couple of times. Rick has an energy that, if those of you who've met him know, is pretty insurmountable. Just after I quit the Higgs cabinet in 2022, and we're talking about this new project, I was feeling about as down as I've ever felt in my life. I didn't regret resigning, but leaving a job of service where every day you get up early and work late to try and make people's lives better, there's no greater honor. And at that point in time, Rick, who is somewhat like, for those of you of a certain age who remember the Energizer Bunny ads, Rick was the prototype. It's like, get off your ass, get to work, we've got to get this done. He's got family commitments that meant he couldn't be here this weekend, and he is incredibly sad about that and asked me to pass on his best wishes to convention, which I'm happy to do. Would also like to take a moment and thank Blair McPherson and Julie Smith, who have together pulled together this convention. It was a team of volunteers, I know, but the leadership that was required to be able to pull something together out of nothing is pretty impressive, and I think so far, for me, turning up at an event where the materials are ready, there's food served, the lights are on, and we're all in our room and ready to work, that's a great sign of success already. So as far as I'm concerned, Blair and Julie Barr. One of the things this party is going to talk about is service, and I wanted, before I get into the main content of my remarks today, to ask those in the room who have served our country in uniform the day before Remembrance Day this year to stand for a moment, and then for the rest of us to have a minute of silence as we remember those fallen for democracy, for our ability to stand here and talk about the future of our country. So I could ask those of you appropriate to stand, and the rest of us to be silent for a minute. Thank you. I'm also going to put on the thing that's very important for any politician, is my timer, so if I start to go over, it goes over. So why are we here? We're here to build on the country that was left to us by those who fought and died war after war for our country. Who those in peacetime, in the post-war years, built a country of nearly unequaled wealth and prosperity and equality, carving it out of a landscape that was cold and inhospitable, from the rocks in the Atlantic to the now rapidly melting permafrost in the north, to the Pacific and the gateway to a rising Asia. We built a country out of institutions, strong institutions, and those are the foundations on which we have to do our work. Because if we are going to be radical in the way we propose changes for this country, those radical changes have to be built on a solid foundation. We have to remember who we are, where we came from, and on which land we stand. Et pour moi, l'histoire de notre Canada, c'est une histoire basée sur les valeurs. la valeur d'inclusivité, d'égalité, trouver les meilleurs dans nos voisines, de travailler fort, d'avoir l'opportunité pour avancer malgré où on a commencé dans notre vie. We have a history with bright chapters, brighter than most in the history of any country in the world. Because let's take a second and remember that it was only a century and some years ago that women won the right to vote. A few decades before that men who weren't born to wealth were allowed to vote. The accomplishments of our modern world are ones that we take too often for granted, but they are the product of the work that came before us to fight for an expansion of rights. The right to start businesses, the right to join a trade union, the right to speak freely and criticize your leaders. These are exceptions, and they remain exceptions in the world today. And every time we talk about how we can improve our country, how we can make Canada the country we want it to be, that we know it can be, we have to start with our history. And I have been troubled in recent years by an effort on the one side to present our history as an unbroken string of crimes and oppressions, and on the other, a Pollyannish view of a country which has never committed any sins at all. Let's be honest. That's what this party is about. Let's be brave. That's what this party is about. Let's talk about the fact that our country has bright moments and dark ones. And the only way that we can handle dealing with the legacy of the dark moments in our past is by talking about them. And we do that. There are countries around the world today, including democracies, where even talking about your country's past is illegal. Where you can't talk about things your country has done. You can't talk about things your government has done to its people. So the very fact that we have the ability to self-criticize in Canada is one of the most precious gifts given to any generation of human beings in the history of our species on this planet. We live at a particularly incredible moment in time where we've inherited this mature democracy with the incredible complexity around us. When the system that gave us our politics was created, there was none of the world that we see around us. There was no equal rights. There was only the vaguest conception of human rights, and generally only applied to rich people with the word Lord before their name. It was a world of great inequality and of material poverty. 150 years ago, the wealthiest men and women in the world lived in conditions that we would view as being unbelievably squalid, dirty, lives that were short, cut short by diseases that now we treat with a 5-minute visit to the pharmacy and a pill. We live in a miracle. And the thing that scares, I think, most of us in this room and why we're here is that I'm afraid we are giving away this miracle. Because we see again this division of an old politics. On the left, a politics of grievance against our country and its past. And on the right, a blind nationalism. A nationalism that says that somehow what defines Canada isn't the incredible country we built and the wealth that it enjoys. It isn't the fact that we have brought people together from around the world for decades now, and they have integrated seamlessly into Canadian society. From me, my family coming from the UK when I was a little kid, others in the room who came to Canada at different points in their lives, people coming from all corners of the world, all faiths and none, all coming to Canada because they saw in this place the opportunity for a better life. They saw the opportunities to start businesses. They saw the opportunities to enjoy a healthcare system where the best minds in the world produced vaccines that allowed us to live more than twice or 3 times the life expectancy of people who lived just 6 or 7 generations before us. Again, it's a miracle. We have got to talk about civic nationalism. I like to joke sometimes that I'm a 2014 conservative, that I think that we should go all the way back to 2014. Because in 2014, where were we as a country? We accepted gay rights. And let me be very clear, in this party, there will be no discussion about the erosion or degradation or questioning of rights for any member of the Canadian family. And I'm going to come back to that later because to me, one of the greatest achievements of our democracy, something we do not talk about enough, is the creation of private lives, free from the interference of government, and a public space where everyone can participate in the work of government. These are incredible achievements that we need to be much, much more proud of. But we also need to be humble. I think we need to be honest. We do face great challenges. We have a country now sitting nearly, again, for those of us of a certain age, somewhat alarmingly a quarter of a way through the 21st century. You can see that basically tell how old people are based on their reactions to that stat in the room. Just think we're nearly as far away now as the 1970s were to 2000. I'll just leave now, I think. But the challenges of that post-war world, they were an unequaled and unprecedented opportunity and challenge for the people who came before us doing the work that we want to do in helping to run this country. 100 plus years ago, there was no healthcare system. It was basically a public education system run by the provinces, in some cases still with the influence of church and community groups. We had no system to save people who, through accidents or bad decisions, fell on hard times. We were a country of great poverty. And that was changed nearly overnight after the Second World War. But now, in the decades since, we've seen what happens to all human structures. We've all done this. Those of us who've had jobs for more than a couple of years, experienced the same thing for a longer period of time, you get a bit complacent, you get a bit bored. And you can see that in our political class, where the only real ambition is not to solve problems like child poverty or our lack of productivity or our competitiveness problem that we're facing with our allies. Not about how to prepare our country for conflicts that appear to be looming. We've got to start talking about how we can connect our politics again to results, about making democracy deliver. Because our political class are just going to work every day. I've been there. I've sat and negotiated with federal ministers, talked with heads of state from around the world. And you can see it in the stateful countries, that there's this level of comfort where we can't really believe that this is all falling apart. And I would guess that people who are interested in the Canadian Future Party shared my reaction to the election on Tuesday night in the United States. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Mr. Trump. He spends far too much time talking about himself. But I'm going to talk briefly about how his rise to power is a wake-up call for us here in Canada. Because it's getting close. What we saw with the rise of demagoguery and populism in the UK with Brexit, the rise of far-right neo-fascists even across Europe, the rise of demagogic left-wing populists in Central and Southern America, all of these forces united to try and say that, you know what, democracy isn't actually the best system. Because it's not based in local culture, local religion, ethnicities. The civic nationalism that this party is proud to represent of an open, caring society, an open country where yes, we compete, yes, we fight and work hard, but when it comes to the end, we are all Canadians working together, living together, sharing this space until we can build that civic nationalism. The ethnic nationalism of the autocrats and dictators will continue to advance because we've kind of lost our way in democracy. Increasingly, we talk about how we have to make concessions to those of us who say that here at home or around the world that our fundamental rights can be abridged, our successes can be rolled back, because that's just reality. It's difficult. Who's going to push back against the Russians? My God, there's 1.5 billion Chinese. How can we possibly push back against them? There's this feeling that we've lost our mojo. I want us to get it back. I want us to go back to being proud of our institutions while recognizing their flaws. Because the dynamic in Canada today, when our politicians aren't arguing about recyclable Tim Hortons coffee cup lids, which is of course incredibly important, and not to disparage that issue, but having spent 3 weeks this summer with MPs from both sides going back and forth on this issue, I was left just thinking, isn't there something better than this? Isn't there something better than a party that on the one hand apologizes for everything, and on the other hand, a party that says it has nothing to apologize for ever? Can't we have something between arrogance and bullying that masquerades as strength on the one hand, and weakness and vacillation masked as conciliation and compromising on the other? We can compromise, but never at the cost of our values. We can be strong, but never at the cost of exploiting or pushing down on those weaker than us. To me, that's what Canada is all about. And a brief digression, because this issue has come up, and those of you who were in the room last night, I mentioned the horrifying rise of toxicity online in the days since the American election, with young men across this continent and even around the world pushing the idea that women have no rights, pushing memes online saying, "Your body, my choice." We have allowed, in part because of our embrace of the culture wars that Denis Blanchette mentioned in his remarks earlier, we've allowed culture wars that undermine our solidarity and our recognition of each other as all being part of a shared human experience on this piece of the planet. We've allowed ourselves to be divided. So again, let me be clear. Everyone has rights. And that includes the young men who we need to reach out and show that there can be positive examples of masculinity. Just as the feminist movement correctly and still an ongoing struggle showed that women can take an equal place alongside men. We need to make sure that we return to what I would argue are the fundamental human values that drive this party and built this country, which is that everyone is the same fundamentally. We have different approaches to the world, and I'm going to talk about that. We have different ways of enjoying the world, and that's fantastic. But in the end, we have a public space and we have a private space. The history of our planet is of governments, leaders, kings, barons, princes, dictators, general secretaries, presidents, prime ministers, whatever you want to call them, saying that you have to do what I tell you. I have the right as a leader to come into your home. I have the right to take your property. I have the right to restrict your movements. And that was normal for all of human history until the last generations. And the great accomplishment for me of our society, so we often talk about human rights, we talk about the wealth our economy has brought us. For me, it's that creation of the private sphere, of the place where we can do what we want, if it doesn't hurt other people. And I've used two brief stories to contrast this. The last couple of weeks, the horrifying government in Iran that routinely murders its own people in large numbers, continued the lifelong torture of the women unfortunate enough to have to live in that country as they further expand the dress codes that women are forced to live in. And in Afghanistan, a country where, along with a couple of other folks in this room, I've had the opportunity to work for different periods of time. And I saw women who thanked me as a Canadian for protecting their rights. And we walked away. And when we walked away, not only did we leave the people who worked with us to die, we left women who last week were told by the Taliban government that we've allowed, like Trump, to return for a second time without plan or preparation, have now told women that the burqa is no longer enough, because the burqa had a little eye mesh you could see through. Now, there's a veil that comes down over that. Women are no longer allowed to talk to each other. Women can't see the sky. Ever. Today, in 2024, a few thousand miles from here, that's the law. And then I contrast that to a friend of mine, Tara mentioned earlier. Used to fly airplanes, used to be a flying instructor. And I had a friend in New Brunswick, works as an EA, an educational assistant in elementary school, looks after kids with autism. He and his daughter, Violet, went flying one day in a little airplane. And they flew, landed in the field, and took her, and they walked around, and he talked to her about the plants and the vegetables and the trees, and they talked about how pretty the sky was, how beautiful the ground was. This little kid just enjoying life, incredible experiences. And And then they flew home and went home, had a nice dinner, and that was their day. An unremarkable day in the life of an ordinary Canadian and his daughter. But for me, Matt and Violet are exactly what we're fighting for. The ability for people to go and do something they enjoy. Something that would seem totally insane, impossible even 150 years ago. Forget about the idea of flying the airplane. The fact of being able to move from one place to another, land in some field somewhere, not risk being caught by the police, not risk getting in trouble, be able to say and do what you want as long as it doesn't harm others. And I use the example of flying because to me it's an illustration of the sort of society we want to build through this party. Rules-based, but rules that deliver freedom. Because this party, I want it to be living on that difficult line between individual freedoms and group responsibilities. Because you go too far in one direction, too few laws, and you have anarchy. I've lived in countries with too few laws. We do not want that. Libertarianism is the ideology of the infant, believing that somehow everything will be just fine if you can do exactly what you want, and not recognizing that the only reason you have the space to be able to say and think things like that is because you live in a country, in a society based on rules and laws. Without rules, without laws, the dictators prevail. So, when I talk about personal versus public freedom, obviously, this party is about what we do together. But first, making it clear that we will leave people to have that private life, I think is absolutely critical. And I'm here today because we haven't yet adopted our policies. I'm not going to talk in detail about our policy resolutions because that is our collective choice as convention. I want to talk to you about my approach to leadership and my approach to how we're going to approach the big picture questions with this party. So, when we talk about the freedoms to get together, to use freedom of speech, to express ourselves, that comes to another area where that line between individual and collective responsibility comes into play. We've seen, from coast to coast to coast in this country in recent years, the near total collapse of law enforcement. This is something that I find inexplicable, dangerous, and the fact that we don't talk about it all the time to be a risk to our country in the immediate sense. When I served as a politician, both as a minister and as a representative serving the community, I heard time after time of the police not able to, because of their resourcing problems, to respond to calls for anything other than immediate threats to the life of a citizen, and sometimes even then, calls would take an hour to be answered. We have got to be tough on crime and the causes of crime equally. Tough on crime because no one deserves to live with insecurity. Tough on the causes of crime because most criminals do become criminals because they didn't have the opportunity to find something better to do with their lives. For those with whom it's hard-baked, that's why we have a prison system. But for others, we've got to be working to make sure that we constantly reduce on the one side those who may fall into a life outside of the law, and on the other side, make sure that the consequences for law-breaking are clear and severe, because that is the only way that humans respond. It's a testimony to the incredible law-abiding nature of this country that we have managed for the last few years to continue along without having a lot of law enforcement. It speaks to the importance of culture. I've talked to some friends who come from countries that are generally less well organized. I say, God, people are just leaving their bikes out just with a chain on them. People don't necessarily lock their cars. In my part of the country, people still don't even lock their houses. Although that's now sadly changed in recent years. So we've got to talk about how we draw that line of law and then strictly enforce it. And I raise that in particular because it connects to something else that Tara mentioned around my arrest this summer. That we've got to talk as well about the connection between politics in our streets and politics in our parliaments. That parliamentary politics is the single best way to generate wealth and prosperity and equality for the people of this country. That is without question. The evidence is there. Countries that are rich are countries that are democratic, or they're becoming rich by taking our money, which we foolishly give them, which I'll come back to in a little bit. But we are the engine of growth. We are the engine of positive social change, the engine for human rights. And one of the reasons we were able to get here was because we created a legal system which included within it, as a last resort, the ability for citizens to exercise a right of protest up to and including their arrest for protesting laws or actions that they believe are unjust. We have slid, as part of what I would argue is a slide in our culture in recent years and decades, to believe that absolutely the right to protest is there. But that right is actually unrestricted. You can protest wherever you want, however you want. Infringing on other people's rights is no longer a concern. The voice of the loudest prevails. And that is the exact opposite of what our system is supposed to protect. And so when I stood up in Toronto this summer and was arrested for being one out of 500 people standing up against Hamas, the fact that I was arrested was just fine with me, because that proved the point. One person speaking about nonviolence, one person saying free Palestine from Hamas, versus 500 loudly saying the opposite. If we're serious about minority rights, that starts with making sure that the minority is heard when it comes to our protests. And obviously that applies to our Jewish community with some of the horrors we've seen in recent days. Because we know that, yes, democracy is the only system that can work, but if we don't make sure it's protected visibly in the public sphere, where people can see whether people are able to exercise their rights or not, if they don't feel that, if they don't see it, we're going to lose things very quickly. And we'll see that threat against democracy. We'll see the pressure against democracy that's already built in. People saying, it doesn't get things done. We need a dictator. Dictators can make things happen. Even our generally rather fluffy prime minister said that when he talked about how he admired the Chinese basic law of the Chinese Communist Party, which says that, in essence, the party can change any law it wants to advance the causes of the party. That is not what we're about. We're about democracy. Not just about democracy, but the belief in the necessity of expanding democracy. Because it's become clear that there can be no cohabitation with dictators. The autocrats who reject the idea of private life, the autocrats who reject the idea that there should be any space free from politics or free from the long arm of government, surveillance and control, those people are organized. The Russian and Chinese dictators don't care if the Russians act like Chinese or the Chinese act like Russians. What they care about is the protection of a system of government that allows their leaders to decide for their entire population. And where did we, as a country, go wrong that we allowed this to become acceptable? That we allow some man or group of men to stand up and say that I have never talked to my people because my people don't need to be talked to. Their culture says that they would prefer me to tell them what to do. It's kind of astonishing that regardless of what culture in the world, there's always men who want to make that argument. They always want to make the argument that freedoms might work in your context, but we live in a special and different context. This time is unique and doesn't suit multi-party democracy. We need to push back against that forcefully and to say loud and clear that the only system of government on the face of this earth that has legitimacy is one derived from a mandate of the people, elected through free and fair and regular elections, defended by a free press, supported by the rule of law, with freedoms of expression, of movement, of and from religion. These are the fundamentals that we know make for a decent society and are going to be the heart of this party's work. Democracy. And I often hear people say that there's a conflict between democracy and multiculturalism. Rubbish. We showed for decades that people from around the world, they could all work together. What it requires, though, is a courage from the part of us who have the honor of holding a Canadian passport to say, this is what it means to be Canadian. Not as the beginning and end of any conversation, but as part of a continual discussion to continually improve our country by listening to new voices, but always locked into a framework of democratic, open values. Because that's the world we're moving towards. A world divided between open societies and closed societies. And if we want to keep our society open, we have to start being honest about the challenges that governments face. I had the honor during COVID of serving as my province's education minister, working on the only all-party committee in the world that managed New Brunswick through that crisis. As a result of a paper that Julie and I wrote, the New Brunswick government adopted structures that brought all leaders together to manage that terrible time in our country's history. The result of that, we didn't have a death from COVID in New Brunswick until nearly a year after the pandemic began. We managed to have one of the best results in the world until the vaccines came out that were the whole purpose for the restrictions that we put in place. Because we did put restrictions in place. And I make no apologies for those. Because we will face times of disease and war and crisis when the words spoken by Mr. Poilievre, who said that he would never introduce restrictions based on a pandemic again, God help us all. If we have a disease that hits our country, 40% fatality rate without vaccination instead of 2 we had with COVID, we need serious grown-ups running our country who understand that sometimes there's a need for sacrifice. And when I say serious grown-ups running the country, I don't just mean the politicians. It means citizens have to take responsibility for how we act collectively. And the biggest crime of the COVID era was government afterwards to recognize that this was a conversation that they needed to have, that rights were taken away. That should have been explained more clearly, it should have been defined more clearly, and we should have used the years afterwards to start building preparations for the next pandemic, the next war, the next time when our rights are in question, so people feel comfortable knowing that there is a commitment to return to full openness, to full freedom, as soon as possible. That we only fight, we only have restrictions so that we can open. We only have laws so we can have freedom. These are not conflicting issues. They're complementary, they go together. And any government that argues that freedoms can be abandoned without apology, or that freedoms must never be infringed, these are people who are not serious and are not being honest with Canadians about the challenges we face. Because I think we have to talk a bit about our context as a country. We're facing an unparalleled moment. I've told many of you the story at a centralized Canadians event in Halifax where Liberal, Tory, and NDP activists talked together in front of a packed room about things they had in common, areas we could work together. And a student came up at the end from Acadia University and said, I'm in my early 20s, the other students with her, same age, said I've never been to a political event where people disagreed and didn't yell at each other. And for those of us over the age of 30, think about the politics younger people, younger Canadians are growing up with. We think of our country as a country of stability, order, peaceful and slow change. The world is being based on rules where we know where we stand in the international community. That world is gone. The world of the last 10 years is marked by chaos and disruption and the end of that old order. And if we want to give honor to the statement that that young woman made in Halifax, then our party's work is that much more important. Because if we don't find some way to show that citizens can connect to this political system in a time of chaos and upheaval, they're going to disengage. And the further they disengage, at a time when social media is more and more controlling our discourse, at a time when algorithms that we have absolutely no control over, hosted by foreign countries and foreign lands, unaccountable, in some cases the algorithms unknown even to the people who own them. If you ever want to get really frightened, go and read what Mr. Musk, Mr. Zuckerberg say about the algorithms that drive their profits. They've become so complex, the people inside them, I need a timer, that the people inside them don't even know themselves what they're directing people to do because their only motive is profit. Profit is fine, but profit that comes at the cost of social disintegration is not. And if we want to talk about how to include young people, we're going to start that in this party with our youth council that will pair our young members with older members who've got expertise in the areas that the young members are interested in, and just as important for me, can tell stories from now what is a past time, when things worked, how they worked, when people could be civil with each other. Because that's where we have to take these conversations away from politics in terms of parties and meetings like this. And as Tara was saying, go out and talk to Canadians. We need to talk about how citizens have a responsibility. Your politicians are not these remote figures controlling vast wealth and influence. They're just folks like you. There's good, there's bad, there's smart, there's dumb, there's well-meaning and profoundly bad, and they're just like us. What they have is a responsibility. We need to be clear about the responsibility that we're giving them. So I'd ask you to flip John Kennedy's line around about ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you, or instead what you can do for your country. Apply that as a citizen and talk to people all the time. It's become so painful talking about politics. I can usually talk a lot about just about anything, and I found it nearly impossible to engage with people who are on the demagogic populist side. We need to work together on the tools that we can use to reach them. I don't pretend to have the answers there. But I do know that it has to be a conversation that, again, starts on values and ends on getting things done. The rest of the day, we're going to talk policy. We're going to talk about defense, procurements, immigration, the economy, the things that matter to Canadians. But they need to know and trust that this party is going to have the processes in place and the people in place that we will perform our job. Because political parties are critical in between citizens and government. That's where they live. And their job is to be a filter. Their job is to be able to take people and ideas that are dangerous to our commonwealth and make sure they don't reach positions where they can cause general harm. That involves all of you. We're going to go from here and set up our riding associations. Recruit members at the local level. Take this job with the utmost seriousness. This is not a party repeating the failures and mistakes of parties from the 90s onwards. We want quality. We want people who you are going to be proud of. People who you know are going to be able to represent this party properly. People who you know share its values. What's going to derail us is going to be the old parties, the old politicians saying, these guys are just the same. That's what they want. They want to be able to draw everyone down into the same mess because that's the mess where they're comfortable and where they live. And it also means they can continue to ignore the areas where they need to change. If we can be disciplined, if we can be bold, if we can say we do not analyze any problem by saying whether it is more left or more right, but instead whether it will move our country forward, that to me will be the sign of our success. My goal is that next year we present candidates in ridings across this country and we get a couple of people elected. If we get more, that's fantastic. And something you'll get used to with me if I try and answer every question as honestly and bluntly as I can. So, are we going to win the next election? Probably not. But why not try? Right? That's the attitude that built Canada. That's the attitude that built every successful country. It's the idea that led to the creation of our healthcare system and all the other miracles that we take for granted. Why not try? So I'd ask you, convention, as we go out from here today, to go out to Canadians and talk about how they can become involved in this party. Qu'on commence par demander aux citoyens et citoyennes, qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez faire? Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire ensemble pour travailler, pour bâtir un meilleur Canada? We can do things quickly and better. Talking to a couple of folks last night, Hoover Dam was built in 3 years. It's taken about 9 years to fix the culvert in front of my condo building. We lost track of how we can get things done because we're so afraid of upsetting interest groups, unions, businesses. This party is here to break through that logjam. This party is here to tell bold and difficult truths in a time of vagueness and lies in public life. We are going to live up to the highest possible standards, and because we're human, we're going to screw up and we're going to fail sometimes. And when we do, we're going to apologize and we're going to fix our problems and we're going to move on. Because that's how we handle our lives as adults, with our families, in our businesses if we're successful, in our offices. Why on earth do we apply a totally different standard to politics, where we want our politicians to act like monarchs or emperors, to be remote and distant and be acting arbitrarily? No one wants that. And part of making a really democratic government in a really democratic country means saying, I'm sorry. It means saying, I don't know everything. It means always saying, I'm ready to learn, ready to admit I'm wrong. It means using science and the scientific method as the best means of discerning truth from falsehood. And in a world where falsehood is becoming increasingly difficult to tell from truth, with deepfake videos and images. We need that basis in truth and reality. That starts today with our resolutions, with adopting a constitution, with giving this party the tools it needs to go and build its riding associations, to sign up members, and further developing our policies so that we answer Canadians' questions about what would you do differently. So in closing convention, I just want to thank you for being here. There's big sports games on, it's a long weekend in many parts of the country. What was that one? There's also a Springsteen concert. Many players, I'm sorry. At least we're not conflicting with Taylor Swift. I would guess that we know. But you care. You care, and you dare to believe that we can do things differently. Moi aussi. J'ose d'imaginer qu'on peut créer un meilleur Canada. Alors ensemble, on commence dès qu'aujourd'hui. Canadian Future Party starts now. The future starts now. It starts with you. Sign up members, raise money, found your riding associations, but not for the old political reasons of just building a party for the sake of a party, but because we have a time-limited challenge to change Canada. Let's change the debate, let's elect MPs, and let's make Canada the country it can be. Not going left, not going forward, sure as hell not going back. En avant, going forward. That's what this party is about. Thank you for your time, convention. Merci beaucoup. Et on commence. Thank you, Dominic.